And thanks for being with us on this Friday, March 3rd. Alex-Murdaugh is going to spend the rest of his life in prison. He was sentenced by Judge Clifton Newman this morning following yesterday's guilty verdict of killing his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul. After we hear what was said in court today, we're going to be joined by criminal defense attorneys Brian and Luke Sheely for their take on the verdict, the sentence, and what comes next. Now, we have video of Alex-Murdaugh being escorted into the Colleton County Courthouse this morning for his sentencing hearing. That hearing began with prosecutor Creighton Waters calling for the maximum penalty of life behind bars. There were no impact statements from victims or character witnesses, and no family members or friends came forward to support Murdaugh at all. And before sentencing, Murdaugh chose to briefly address the judge. Here now is some of their exchange.
Your Honor,
Good morning, Your Honor. I'm innocent. I would never hurt my wife, Maggie, and I would never hurt my son, Paw.
well, and it might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills. Maybe you become another person. I've seen that before. The person standing before me was not the person who committed the crime, though it's the same individual. And I know you have to see Paul and Maggie during the night times when you're attempting to go to sleep. I'm sure they come and visit you. I'm sure.
All day and every night.
I'm sure. And they will continue to do so. And reflect on the last time they looked you in the eyes, as you looked the jury in the eyes. And it's so unfortunate because you had such a lovely family of such friendly people, including you, and to go from that to this. All right, Mr. Murdaugh, I sentence you to the State Department of Corrections on each of the murder indictments in the murder of your wife, Maggie Murdaugh. I sentence you for a term of the rest of your natural life for the murder of Paul Murdaugh, whom you probably loved so much. I sentence you to prison for murdering him for the rest of your natural life. And officers may carry forth.
Well, tonight, Alex-Murdaugh is being held at the Kirkland Correctional Facility here in Columbia. The State Corrections Department releasing this mugshot late today. A shaved head, that is the norm in the Department of Corrections once they come into custody there. After an evaluation that will last no more than 45 days, the Department of Corrections will decide where Murdaugh will serve his life prison sentence. After today's sentencing hearing, Chief Prosecutor Creighton Waters spoke with our Andrea Mock outside the Walterboro Courthouse, and he talked about how the state approached this case.
We realize that Alec, as a prosecutor, as a lawyer who does accident cases, he's very familiar with cell phone and digital evidence, and it seemed very clear that he was attempting to manufacture an alibi, which is really ironic that the kennel video ultimately was what was a big part of ensnaring him. It was unlike Alec to not have his phone. We knew he had been at the kennels. It'd be very likely for him not to have it there unless he's trying to create this alibi that he was at home sleeping.
Well, defense attorneys also saying now they're going to appeal the jury's verdict based on the prosecution introducing Murdaugh's now admitted financial crimes into evidence. They also continue to be critical of the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's investigation into the murders.
You know, what we heard was presented to the Colleton County Grand Jury by Detective Owen that Jim crossed, blood spatter that didn't exist, testimony about guns that was wrong. I mean, I can go through the litany with you. Going back to his question, I think SLED needs to do some self-examination on the forensic processing. They did not. I mean, one of the things we complained about was that Maggie's phone would have had all her GPS data on it if they processed it within 5 days. And they because they didn't, the GPS data got overridden.
And we believe that the judge was somewhat misled, because at the conclusion of the case, when Mr. Metters is up on his rebuttal argument in front of the jury, he says to the jury, oh, forget about all that motive evidence. We don't have to prove motive. We just have to prove malice, which is right. But why did they go to all the effort to prove motive when at the end they say, you don't have to believe us on our motive theory? But by then they had cast Alec as a despicable human being, and that was the reason they offered it in the first place. And we think the appellate courts will take a strong look at that. We feel like that is a very solid ground for an appeal.
We're going to talk about that now with our criminal defense lawyers, our legal experts tonight, Brian and Luke Shealy. Guys, again, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.
First, let's dive into how fast this verdict came down. You guys weren't with us last night. Any surprises there?
Well, we've been saying for a while, if it came back the same day, it would be a guilty verdict. It is somewhat surprising for a trial of this length with so much evidence physically. I think we're at 600 exhibits or so. But it was pretty clear that I think the initial numbers were 9 guilty, 2 not guilty, 1 undecided. And when you have that kind of spread, it's just about, as far as the guilty crowd, to kind of win over the other crowd. It was a little short, but it did spell doom for Alex Murdaugh.
And I believe that jury member that you're talking about said that the evidence basically was overwhelming. The circumstantial evidence in this case, Brian, overwhelming, pointing to the guilt of Alex Murdaugh.
Absolutely, JR. I think, they were looking at, 99 financial crimes, and as my brother and I have been talking about, in a double murder case. And at the end of the day, after hearing the crimes in terms of motive, but were also used to demonstrate you can't trust anything that comes out of Alex Murdaugh's mouth, the quick deliberation time for a trial with this much evidence reflects really just a overwhelming sense of guilt by the 9. And it was like, we don't need to just comb through the evidence and let's make up our minds. Our minds are made up. Now who are the 2 that are not guilty? Who's the 1 that's undecided? What are your issues? And let's sort them out for you, is basically what happened.
You're talking about Murdaugh's lies. The defense saying today even Mother Teresa wouldn't have been able to save Alex Murdaugh here, Luke.
It's a tough thing for a jury to do. They're not supercomputers. You hear just wave after wave of what we call bad character evidence about, these people that he represented, that he had this fiduciary duty of trust to take care of, and he stole from them. And then you have to decide a murder case where he's being inconsistent and being the last one really there, so close in time to a murder. They can't just parse it out. They're normal, average folks. And it definitely goes in, even though Judge Newman gave them an instruction saying, hey, it's only to be considered for motive. You can't say that because he's so bad there that he's bad guy here. They're just people, and it's impossible to do. And so I can't speak to what happened inside that jury room, but I can speak to my experience. And when you have stuff like that, it's extremely powerful and impactful, and that's why the defense is talking about a potential appeal based on that issue.
Right. One of the shortest sentencing hearings that I can recall in recent years. No family members, not his son, not his brother, not his other brother, not his sister, none of his friends, his closest acquaintances, no one steps up, Brian, today to speak up for Alex Murdaugh.
You're right, JR. We had 2 important elements of the sentencing hearing today that were lacking. Number 1, the defense team usually get up and mitigate on behalf of their client. They argue facts, they argue law, they argue what we call just hallmarks of true mitigation. And then they usually bring in, people that, love their client, that can attest to their client. And so we didn't have anything from the defense team, number 1, which is very interesting. Luke and I have been wrestling with this concept because it is the hardest thing for a trial team to do, is at the end of especially a lengthy trial like this that's heavily contested, and you're in the trenches and it's a real battle. and then if your client is found guilty, you're faced with the hardest thing that you can possibly do as a trial lawyer, getting up before the judge and begging for mercy when you're frustrated, you're tired, you're mentally drained and exhausted, and then do the thing that's really tough. So that was absent in this case. I think Luke and I have come down to the conclusion that was probably strategic by the part of Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian in terms of future post-conviction relief efforts. Basically the ineffective assistance of counsel kind of concept, and if your lawyers are not asking for the lowest sentence possible at your sentencing hearing, then maybe they're ineffective. Regarding no family members asking for anything on either side of the aisle, whether it's Maggie's family or whether it's Buster and John Marvin getting up to ask for the shortest sentence possible under the law, which is 30 years. Mm-hmm. Why don't we have that? And, there is a lot of credible reporting, JR, that, from national kind of reporters and maybe even some of your own reporting down in that area, that both sides of the family are now convinced that he maybe didn't do this thing after hearing all of the evidence. So that's quite interesting. We're hearing it from a lot of different reporting down there who were speaking to both sides. Maybe that's another reason why they were not vocal in court today, if they're not firmly convinced that he did it. And that would be an amazing result, because a normal murder case, at the end of a trial, if there's a conviction, the victims want their day in court. They want to be vocal. They're asking for justice. Now that a jury has secured it for them with the assistance of the prosecution. So I've never seen a quiet sentencing hearing like this.
Right.
It's absolutely unique. This whole trial has been unique, but never seen it in our time handling these kind of cases.
Luke, he continued to maintain his innocence in court today. He stood there in front of the judge. He says he did not do it again.
That's right. And to say anything different could damage his appeal. Typically, like we said, you expect to hear, you got a sentencing range of 30 years to life on murder. So you didn't hear anything from the lawyers about why he deserves 30. But he spoke and clearly wanted to be said one final time that he would never hurt Maggie and Pawpaw, as he says. And then, of course, Judge Newman spoke a lot, and you had the state asking for a consecutive life sentence, which they got. That's what Creighton Waters asked for. Mm-hmm. Nothing was asked for on the defense side, which was quite unexpected. But he's going to maintain his innocence to the end, because if he were to say, you know what, I'm sorry, Judge, give me mercy, 30 sounds pretty reasonable, please forgive me, I did it, the gig's up, he kills any chance of appeal, because he's essentially confessed to it. So he certainly wasn't going to do that, whether he's innocent or guilty. You rarely ever have any client talk. We've been in that position, and we certainly counsel our clients not to really speak on that. And Judge Newman kind of referenced that a little bit today about how he hasn't really had folks who've been found convicted by a jury of murder really come clean, so to speak. And so he was waxing lyrical today a lot.
We will get to Judge Newman's performance in a moment in the courtroom, but I want to ask about the defense plans to appeal and some of the grounds, Brian, they said they're going to appeal on. Dick Harpootlian, Jim Griffin meeting with the media today saying, hey, we're going to appeal. If we have to go all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, we're going to appeal, because the state should never have been allowed to introduce the alleged financial crimes in as evidence. And we say alleged. He has admitted to financial crimes during the course of his double murder trial, but at the time he had not done that, and they were alleged financial crimes being admitted into evidence. Does the defense have a case here?
Certainly. And the rule is they've got 10 days from the conviction to file what's called a notice of intent to appeal, and that preserves their ability to later file a fleshed out appeal. The interesting thing on this case, so the state is able to, under the theory exception of motive, let in other crimes and bad acts has been covered extensively over these past 6 weeks, but it was really used in cross-examination to call him a liar. And so not only did it call him a liar and it convinced the jury that we can't trust him when he says, I didn't do this, it also caused him, as you just said, JR, to, testify in a way that he had to confess to the other charges that were facing against him. And so he's waived his essentially been forced to waive his right to remain silent on those matters to gain credibility in a jury trial that felt sometimes more about the financial crimes than it did the double murder. And so that does compound the 404B analysis, and it does give certainly some consideration to an appeal that will probably be focused a lot on those financial crimes. It's going to force him to take a guilty plea. He's not going to do a trial on those now. The question will be, does Dick Harpootlian pursue that himself, the appeal with his law firm, or is it going to be a different firm? Because as I mentioned, there's post-conviction relief concepts too. So you get the appellate issues, which it could come back on appeal, but if you exhaust those, you also have what's called a post-conviction relief procedure, where it basically says your appeals are exhausted, but yet let's analyze if the applicant files it, if Alex-Murdaugh files it, that your lawyers were ineffective. Now let's consider, were they ineffective, and should you get a new trial based on that? And so if your lawyer, who later on that you're going to have to say maybe was ineffective, who's also doing your appeal, that's an interesting concept.
Also today, the defense attorneys once again attacking the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, basically saying they did a shoddy job with the investigation here, that the crime scene was not secure, that things were not handled properly. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division Chief Mark Keel defending his agency today, saying they did everything they could to make sure this was a fair investigation and make sure that justice was served for Maggie and Paul Murdaugh. So the verdict is in. He's sentenced to life in prison. They're going to appeal based on the alleged financial crimes. Why continue to attack? Why does the defense continue to attack the SLED investigation?
Well, they're holding a press conference, and that was a huge feature of the case, so they're going to bring it up again. But, I mean, SLED made some serious unforced errors here, and I will say it's a feature of any defense on any case to attack the investigator or investigation. Sometimes there's very little to attack, and that's how you partly try to create reasonable doubt. But in this case, there was a lot to attack, going from, the way the scene was preserved or lack thereof, with the footprints, not collecting Maggie's phone in a certain way that would help preserve that pinging data that we heard a lot about. You've got, honestly, the lead investigator really being grilled about lying to the grand jury that secured the indictments on two different issues. So they got a little bit embarrassed, and of course Dick Harpootlian and the defense has been highly critical of them throughout. They've been really criticized for always having one suspect, and he was never out of that circle of suspicion. So, of course, on a high-profile case, you've got Mark Keel coming out and really defending his agency, wanting to be the figurehead, and taking a little bit of a victory walk. But they will not like some of the unforced errors. They'll have to do some self-analysis.
You guys have been on social media. You've seen the praise for Judge Clifton Newman in this case from the very beginning, especially over the last couple of days. Brian, how would you grade the job that Judge Newman did when it comes to handling this high-profile case?
It's difficult to grade a judge that I've had so much experience with. I almost feel like I've been raised up in the law trying cases before him. Mm-hmm. But I would grade him, I'd give him an A for the way he handled the high-pressure, media-intensive aspect of this case. There were a lot of, protections for the jurors, for certain pieces of evidence, the way he secured and conducted himself in court. Now, I don't agree with some of his rulings. And often when I'm in front of Judge Newman, I may not agree with some of his rulings, especially if they're going against me. I think he did an A job on generally handling such a high-profile case with his judicial temperament. I mean, his judicial temperament is second to none. Now, on the legal rulings, I give him a C. From a defense lawyer, because the financial crimes, like we just talked about, caused Alex Murdaugh to have to confess to those on his murder trial. And that was huge. I also don't necessarily believe that once the roadside suicide attempt was excluded, I don't necessarily believe that Jim Griffin opened that door. And that's a judgment call for Judge Newman. He's vastly experienced. He defined it as a door-opening moment. The Court of Appeals will decide. But I give him a C on those big issues. But how he handled a case of this he didn't make it about himself. Some judges that have a national eye they can't help but make it about themselves. He's a really cerebral judge. It's all about the law for him. He's relatively humble on the bench. Now sentencing is different. He'll speak his mind, but throughout the trial, as the lawyers are trying it, it's never about Judge Newman. It's about having the jury get the best moment to evaluate the case.
Luke, I'm going to let you weigh in as well on this. Judge Newman had some pictures taken down off the walls inside the courthouse of the Murdaugh family, basically saying wants to give the defendant a fair shot here. So he took down the pictures of some of his ancestors before him. How would you grade the judge and how he handled the case?
I think my brother did a pretty good job of summing that up. I mean, his temperament is great. He's always got command of the courtroom. There are some judges out there that can lose command of the courtroom, and lawyers get this idea that if they just keep arguing, they'll eventually persuade him. You never get that sense in Judge Newman's courtroom. He's always got total power control. I mean, regarding the kind of historic family paintings of, I think it was Alex Murdaugh's father or either a grandfather, longtime solicitors in that area of the world, I think that was decided pre-trial, I think to not, to make it fair, really to level the playing field so that there isn't some undue influence that might assist him, where some juror who's having to stare down Alex Murdaugh's relative, while they think about it. So that was a smart move. It's absolutely the right call. And Judge Newman did a fabulous job throughout, but for the legal rulings, which I agree with Brian, he's second to none in terms of class and temperament. And then he said his piece during the sentencing, which we can talk about. But he is one who will do that. He doesn't hold back on sentencing. He feels like he's lived this case. And if he thinks you're a scoundrel, he'll let you know. If he thinks that you're not being truthful with yourself, he'll let you know. And I think a lot of lawyers in South Carolina were made to look bad and kind of feel a little bit like we're all victims due to one of our own committing the financial crimes in particular.
Let's talk about what happens now, because there's the boat crash from 2019, the fatal boat crash involving Mallory Beach. What happens with that case?
It continues. I mean, that will probably have even more of a national focus than what it did previously. It continues. I think Mr. Tinley's sounds like he's been doing a wonderful job on it. He will aggressively pursue, compensation for Mallory's family. So nothing stops there. I mean, it's gonna carry on. Obviously, Paul's charges are gone with his passing, and there could be some other. We had Mark Keel get up, and in response to, I guess, the criticism against his agency today, in his second only press conference, as he said, but he basically made it very, very clear that anybody that we find out has assisted Alex Murdaugh in any crimes, no stone will be left unturned. We're coming for you. So that statement of intent may lead to additional charges for people that we haven't even heard their names yet. So we'll have to wait and see.
Again, Paul Murdaugh was the alleged driver of the boat in which Mallory Beach died. Gloria Satterfield, the housekeeper, who fell down steps and died. What happens there? Will she be exhumed? Is there some plan to try and investigate her death further?
I don't know. I'm pretty sure even Eric Bland may have some point, who represents that case, have said that they don't believe there's any foul play. The only foul play was really Alex Murdaugh stealing that money right from that family for that settlement. So stuff like this will only help anything that's unresolved. This will only help those causes, victims of Alex Murdaugh, whether for financial, for sure. There'll be a lot of debtors lining up. His law firm, which was highly embarrassed and which had to pay out money of their own pockets for millions of dollars they're also a victim. So those cases will go on, and regarding the financial crimes, I have no idea what is left in Murdaugh's estate, how it's tied up, but debtors will line up, and if restitution is ordered, they will happily receive it.
Stephen Smith, found dead in the middle of the road back in 2015. The Murdaugh name has been mentioned in some conversations with some investigators here. What happens with this case? The mother, Stephen Smith's mother, is convinced foul play was involved, Brian.
Right. I mean, I know their SLED has been investigating that case pretty heavily. I know that there are some also private investigators hired by Stephen Smith's mother and their family to assist. If I'm sure they're tracking down any and all leads. I think the only thing that we know for certain, more likely than not, is that he wasn't struck and killed by a car. Mm-hmm. So I think anything's in play. We see how these state grand jury investigations play out. They get leads, they bring these witnesses in before the state grand jury, and they build a strong case. And only then, after lots of testimony, will they ever bring a case. So we can expect, if there are credible leads in that case, that they will be investigated the same way with the same process. To be continued on that front. I know that everyone wants justice for Mr. Smith, especially given the way we can all agree it was not a motor vehicle accident.
Right. I want both of you to weigh in on this now. Why did this case captivate not only the state, but the nation and people across the world, Luke?
It's just got every kind of drama that would interest people that have nothing to do with South Carolina. They don't know where Walterboro is. You've got privilege, power, dynasty, crumbling. Someone who, if I were to write a movie, I'd be saying someone who thought he could get away with it all, have been doing it for years. You think estates and plantations and moss, and it's almost something out of a kind of like a Prince of Tides type scenario. But so it captivated the world. It really did, due to the murder, the prestige, the power, and the undoing. People seem to like nothing more than seeing somebody in that position get a comeuppance. Mm-hmm. And that's what objectively occurred here, for sure. Whether he's guilty of the murders or not, he has been found guilty. He has been given a comeuppance. And if you're of that mindset, there's a whole big cup of justice that has been filled. So that's just the type of things that movies are made of.
Brian?
Well, everything Luke's saying is my sentiment, but he was also not only a generational kind of family in terms of prestige and privilege. These were prosecutors. As Judge Newman said today in sentencing, I'm looking around this courthouse, I'm thinking about your grandfather who was a prosecutor, your father was a prosecutor, and you were a prosecutor. And he said, I'm appalled because while your double murder charge is eligible for the death penalty, and the state didn't seek it, and he said, I'm not passing judgment on their decision not to seek death, but essentially your family has put people on death row for crimes of less severe crimes than what you did here today, or this jury found you guilty of. That was pretty much to the point of how Judge Newman felt about it. It was prosecutors go after prosecutors that do wrong very aggressively. And I think Judge Newman was clear in his mind that he has that Alex Murdaugh, based on the judgment of the jury, let his family down, let South Carolina lawyers down, and also let prosecutors down. Mm-hmm. And as Alan Wilson said today, no one is above the law, especially not someone that has been embraced in the law all their lives, either through their family's connections or their own ability to prosecute cases. So that Judge Newman kind of said it all today.
All right. Brian and Luke Shealy, criminal defense attorneys. Guys, thank you so very much, not only for tonight, but throughout the course of this trial, for your legal expertise. I know our viewers out there appreciate it so very much.
It's been a pleasure, JR. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. And for now, Alex Murdaugh is locked up at the Kirkland Correctional Facility here in Columbia. This was the mugshot that was released late this afternoon. He will be there no longer than 45 days to be evaluated, and then the South Carolina Department of Corrections will decide where Alex Murdaugh will serve out his life in prison term. Again, he got 2 of those sentences today with no chance of parole. The next time Alex Murdaugh is out of the South Carolina Corrections Department, it will most likely be in a pine box. For more on the Alex Murdaugh story, as always, go to our website, WLTX.com. Thank you for being with us.